Okay, awesome. Yeah, so like Ricardo said, we did the whole ResearchHub Incorporated side, and now we'll move over to the foundation side. Basically, just going to try and give some updates, about what we've been doing, maybe why we're doing it, what's to come, and where we could use your help. So let's see, yeah. So if you don't know me, I'm Tyler Diorio. I'm the community lead. I do a lot of things to interface between the users of actual ResearchHub, the platform, and then the people building the platform and everything in between. So just kind of tagging in, trying to fill the cracks between making sure what you guys want out of the platform is actually being heard by the team. And they're super responsive, so it's been a great job. Aside from that, on the side, or if you're my advisor and you're listening, I mean, full-time, I'm a PhD student in my final year, hoping to graduate this fall. And I would do a couple different projects. Like up top, you're seeing computational modeling work that I do. I have a buddy who grows some neurons on a plate and hits them with pendulum to try and mimic like a football injury, or, you could figure a blast injury if you're in the Army. And so I model it and try and tell him all about the forces on the neurons are feeling. And then also what I do is I have a project on Alzheimer's disease where we're trying to look at the motion of the brain over, a given time period and try to quantify what the brain actually looks like in terms of stress and strain and what it's feeling to predict some of the outcomes. So that's who I am. And then to get into the good stuff, what the foundation is doing is we have a couple different initiatives running right now. The big one is our peer review initiative. And so I'll provide like a little bit of context about how this started. And I guess to kick it off, I'll just tell you how peer review traditionally works. So if you're in academia, this is where it's most relevant, but it starts with an author submitting a manuscript, which is like a full description of research all the way through from describing the problem statement, all the way through to how you did it, what you found, and why it's relevant. They'll submit this manuscript to a journal, and it'll go through a couple rounds of screening. The first of which is just for very basic formatting. And this is just to make sure, you haven't submitted like a totally random document that doesn't actually match the criteria. And then once it passes this very basic check, it moves on to be screened for scope and rigor. So for example, if you're going to talk about archaeology in a biomedical engineering journal, it's like, not a perfect fit. So they want to make sure that they're curating, as Pat said, like a proper scope for their journal. And so you could be rejected at this point in the process, in which you've paid no money. All you've lost is maybe, a couple weeks or less, depending on how long it took them to do this initial review. And the amount of times they do this initial scope and rigor review really depends on the journal. But this is like kind of like a first pass peer review where it's not recorded, it's just an internal kind of thing. So if you pass this, then what happens is one of the editors, usually associates, will go through their list of contacts and reach out to, dozens, hundreds, could be n number of peer reviewers in hopes that they'll find some experts in the field who are willing and able to peer review this. And so like Pat said, this can be, 40 to 50 peer reviewers, cold emailed, and you really don't know like who's going to respond, what they're going to say, or if they don't have time, because they're usually professors or postdocs or even higher. So if you get lucky enough and you get some peer reviews completed, what happens is the peer reviewers will pass those back to the journal and then pass them back to the author. Then you, the author, have to add that really tangential topic that reviewer number 2 suggested, even if it means turning your computational paper into a machine learning paper. You got to make that change. It's not really up to you whether you can choose to accept it or not. There's some debating that can happen, but traditionally you really have to kind of abide by their suggestions and address them, at least textually. And so once you've made these changes and you've kind of addressed all of these big concerns, there's 2 possible outcomes. Number 1 is you can actually still be rejected. Your manuscript can be decided to not meet the rigor for this journal. And this can happen, for example, if you disagree with the peer reviewer, you didn't make the changes sufficiently, or if it's just dragged on for possibly too long. And usually what happens is it'll be accepted for publication. So once you get accepted, this is when, things get kind of strange, is that you have to pay up to, in some cases, $11,700, which is the sample number for Nature currently. And this is money that comes out of the research budget, typically of the PI. And it's after the 3 to 12 month process of peer review that you just underwent. And I've certainly heard numbers on the higher end of that range. And then the peer reviewers who spent all this time kind of, making your science better and contributing to the body of literature don't really get anything out of this. They get $0 and they've given 6+ hours. Usually it takes longer of, several days or weeks at a time, where they're putting in these really hard focus hours, trying to make sure, you've done the science, you've read the prior literature, and you're up to date on what the field has done, and you're also pushing it forward. So it's a big ask for these peer reviewers. Now you might be thinking like, is this even a problem? like, do we have to pay scientists? Are they rich? Like, do they have just, oodles of money coming in where it really shouldn't matter? The answer, in my opinion, is no. And in my experience, no. So if you look at the left, this is the amount of scientific funding that comes into research through the NSF and the NIH each year, 2022 numbers. And it comes out to about 40 billion. This is money you can think about entering scientific research. And then if you take the global cumulative scientific publishing revenue, so this includes many funders outside of these scientific funders, but just to give you a sample of the order of magnitude, they bring in about $19 billion per year in revenue. So it's a very non-trivial amount of money that leaves academic research and is a toll tax on scientific funding that gets passed to these publishers, never making it back to peer reviewers when it probably could. So just to kind of give you the broad view about what does traditional peer review stand for, well, right now it has minimal accreditation to the peer reviewer. So you don't really get published in most cases. The peer reviews don't get published alongside the manuscript. You don't always know who the peer reviewer was, for better or worse. And you don't get to see kind of behind the scenes about how this manuscript became its final form. So it obviously goes through multiple stages, but that's not usually shown. Secondly, publication, once it gets submitted to a journal, is sort of the decision is kind of outside of the hands of the author. It's really up to the peer reviewers in the journal to decide when this publication is ready to actually, hit the button, put it online, show to everybody. Also, peer reviewers are volunteer. So there's many reasons why they do peer review currently, and we know it is getting done. But what's happening is essentially they're contributing to the scientific record. They've had people do this for them before. So essentially they've done it because people have volunteered to give them peer review in the past. So they're kind of being altruistic in the sense of contributing to science. And then also it contributes to if they want to pursue like a tenure track faculty or they want to progress in academia, this is sort of taken into account. So what this leads to is a lot of delays to publication, and people think it's either because there's poorly aligned incentives. There's not really a great offer for the peer reviewers to come in and do this really high technical expertise task. And it's also very difficult to find these peer reviewers in the first place. So there are alternatives and people are working on better ways to do this. We're not the first ones to think critically about it. And to give you a really notable, awesome example that I personally look up to is eLife. They publish their peer reviews alongside the manuscript. And the way in which this looks is essentially when your peer reviews get submitted, they're public. You can know who the peer reviewer is in most cases. And those peer reviewers get passed back to the author who can choose whether or not to accept the peer reviews, which peer reviews to accept, and then also when to publish. So they can go through any amount of iterations on these peer reviews that they think are helpful. So if they don't disagree, they have the choice. If they want to go ahead and just push their paper through, they can do that. And what happens is those peer reviews get posted alongside the actual article and the manuscript. And you can sort of see how this idea evolved over time and see the suggestions that were made or not made. So this is great because it addresses two of those main facets I talked about earlier, because now you accredit the peer reviewer, you give a glimpse into the process, and you've also given control back to the author. But there's still two big problems. Number one being the incentives and the delays. So what we're hoping to do at the foundation in our pilot program is to address these in kind of individual steps. The first of which being the alignment of incentives. So we got 2 grants from Gitcoin in which we were wanting to actually try and pay peer reviewers to evaluate mainly can we get peer reviews solicited and paid for? Will they be of good quality? And will they take too much time, the same time, or less time? So that was kind of our goal to evaluate. We put out a couple articles about it. The Medium article, the Mirror article on the right there gives a lot of really great detail written by Jeff. But we had a great turnout. So I'll flip through a couple examples here just very quickly so you can see, but the gist of it is that we were offering around $150 in ResearchCoin on the platform to complete peer review of a couple different hand-selected preprints that we thought were really interesting. So this first one has to do with some cancer stuff. And so we had an awesome user, Alex, come in, complete this review. We awarded the bounty. We also had another one on motor tasks, so involving some MRI expertise. And one of our users, Levy, who's an excellent open source developer as well, contributed, gave a full, thorough workdown of it. And we had this across around 5 peer reviews. So totally new users such as Umair came on, contributed to science in this open public manner, and really showed what can be done to improve these preprints. Same thing with Rabia and also Pedro. Totally new users coming on and really getting a feel for the platform and doing this peer review in public. So to summarize what this looks like too, is they didn't take too long either. So you have to think about, we solicited these peer reviews and the time to review ended up being on average 2 weeks, plus or minus, 8.5 days. significantly faster than traditional peer review. This could have been like, stroke of luck because it's a very small sample size. It could also be because we had some incentive. We paid on average around $154 plus minus $29 to each of these peer reviewers. The reason why that varies is A, because the token price changes, and B, because other users really appreciate the stuff that's happening. And so they'll go on and independently tip these peer reviewers for their contributions. And what's cool is it wasn't just in one small area. We actually spread these over a couple of different expertise. So we have neuroscience, immunology, oncology, and molecular biology. And peer reviews on all of these kind of happened in this initial pilot program. So we were really happy with the turnout and kind of surprised, to be honest, at how well it seemed to be accepted and completed. So what we want to do next is try and take this one step farther and see what peer review looks like if you can do public inline commenting peer review. So ResearchHub recently put out this feature of inline commenting. And so what better way to test it than to go through these PDFs, these preprints line by line and say what's good about it, what's bad about it, what lines are really important, understated, and all this stuff. And so that's something we want to try and move forward with the next part of the initiative and really try and get more of these inline peer reviews. Also, Pat mentioned the reference manager. We're really curious about how, if we link this all together, so we have curation of articles, we have, for example, commenting publicly, you can write these up in posts or in, with the Word plugin, and how this whole social ecosystem is starting to be built out, and you can have these peer reviews really interchange with all these different aspects of science. So we're really curious about how this all kind of fits into the overall picture of doing peer review in the public. And so we think we partially address like an early iteration of, incentivizing them and showing that it does cause, at least in a small sample size, less delays to publication, or in our case, completion of peer review. So there's still the issue of, it was very difficult to find these individuals who are experts in the area, were willing to contribute, and then also, had the time to do it. So that kind of comes down to quantifying reputation in research, which is a very non-trivial task. Reputation could be, it could span across n different parameters, but the whole gist of it is saying, like, are you qualified to do the task in research that I'm asking you to? And so in this case, it might be peer review this really specific niche document. So there's the traditional way that reputation is like at least quantified in research is through citations, but there's plenty of studies and discussions and individuals who will tell you that citations don't necessarily correlate to reputation or quality. And if they do correlate, sometimes it actually be anti-correlated, meaning it's not representative of good quality, but could actually be representative of bad quality. There's a really nice law, I think it's called Goodhart's law. It says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And the gist of this is basically saying that when people know how the system is built and it's basically they can game it, they can, figure out what ways to get higher citations, because these citations are kind of correlated with funding as well. When you go to apply for a grant to actually do research, the grant committees will look at your publication record, so number of citations, number of publications, and they'll take that into account to determine whether or not you can do this research effectively. But it's kind of a skewed metric, right? Because how can you get publications if you don't have funding to do research? So it's like this really highly intertwined system that doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense. And Ricardo did a great job at illustrating this with this kind of web of connections, where the researcher at the center there takes his research and he wants to publish it in one of these journals. And so his incentive to do that is in order to increase his research metrics. So his citations, impact factor, maybe it'll help him get awards. These will help him progress his career at institutions. But in order to do all this, he has to get funding. In order to get funding, you have to have these metrics and have these credentials. So you can kind of see the problem statement being presented here is that, like, maybe we're not using the right research metrics to quantify reputation. And maybe that's also potentially causing some bad downstream effects too. Yeah, and this one does a great job too at saying, like, they can be gamed. The other problem too is if you're at different tier institutions, it can also affect your grant chances and also your citation chances. So, a really good institution, you might be likely to do a little better than someone who's not at a well-known institution. And whether that's true or not, probably up for debate. Another thing is reproducibility is really not taken into account in any current reputation metrics. And this may be because it's a really difficult thing to quantify, or maybe it's because no one is trying to quantify it, so no one's incentivizing it. So trying to get towards these things, maybe we think we could try and help the system a little bit. And it has been shown like a couple times, especially in the past year, about some of the downstream effects that can happen when you have these poorly aligned incentive structures. People do things or get thrown into things they may not have done otherwise. And so this is one, for example, talking about research that may have been fabricated at a very prominent lab. And it's all too common a story lately. And, we think reputation could be part of the reason why this is happening. So what we're thinking about with ResearchHub, at least from the foundation side, things that are important to us, is we'll have many different user types of people who could come onto the platform and contribute to science. One of them, for example, on the left, maybe a ResearchHub user. Maybe they're a domain expert in their spare time. They go in, they're totally up to date on the literature. They know the field, but maybe they don't have any academic credentials. Well, they deserve some reputation because they've demonstrated it and we could prove it on the platform. Whereas there may be a traditional researcher who hasn't done anything on the platform or any kind of online activity, but they have a lot of publication. And so they also need to have their reputation quantified. And then you may have the super user who's got the best of everything. So kind of spreading out these tiers of different people to anticipate, we can get an idea of what's important and what we need to quantify. But real reputation is super, super complex in research. And this is my best attempt at just throwing up all the parameters I could think of. So breaking them into groups, for example, is one way we can start to pick out, for different tasks in research, you really don't need someone to be an expert in everything. But if you know a lot about their individuals, then you can kind of pick and choose them. So for example, if you got a ton of publications, maybe a little bit minimal peer review, maybe you're not the best peer reviewer, but you're a great person to collaborate with, or, something along those lines. And then you can get more in depth. If we start tracking these peer reviews in public, we can see how many times you've done a peer review, how good the peer reviews have been, how much you publish in open science. Or if you're more involved in public engagement, we can see, public talks that you've done, if you've influenced policy, if people on Twitter are digesting your literature, or if, it's misinforming stuff. And then what I think is personally the coolest one is you can quantify your expertise across given sub areas. So things, if you tag, for example, research across all the 7 levels of depth that it can go. So for example, engineering, bioengineering, neurodegeneration, all the way down the ladder, you can get an idea from someone's public publications and online activity based on what they're an expert in. So for me, this is an example. I'm very good at image-based modeling. I've done a ton of MRI work, but I'm not really excellent in neuroscience. Well, I kind of am, but this is an exaggerated example. I don't have a ton of anatomy experience and all this other stuff. So I may be really good at one aspect of neuroscience, but am I the perfect peer reviewer for a really hardcore neuroscience publication? Maybe not. But maybe I'm really good at determining whether their methods were correct, or if their outcomes match literature, or if they're saying something controversial. So getting a really good look at this from a granular view, maybe we could start to incentivize people to act in a very transparent way, where they're not overstating, and we can really evaluate them. The cool thing too is if we have this really in-depth look, then we can start to maybe pull peer reviewers that are really good at specific things. Maybe this is a really imaging heavy paper, pull an imaging person. Maybe it's hardcore signal processing, pull a signal processing person. And so if you start to take this more granular view, and then you're also paying them, maybe we think this could contribute. So what kind of progress have we made on this? We spent a lot of time over the summer and spring just expanding on a really in-depth plan of action. And so this includes steps to bring a researcher onto the platform, import all of their previous publication history, grab their papers, understand the context of where they've been to conferences, where they're at in university, and then start to do things on top of that, like calculate their citation metrics, see what fields they're in, and start to blow out all these individual little parameters. And we've been really lucky to have an awesome open source developer working on it. So far, it's been Levy, who's one of our main contributors, who's been blowing out these functions. And we've also have another open source developer, Matt, who's going to be coming on board and trying to work with us as well. And what's cool is we cover right now Web 2 and academic research. So we're really good at this initial implementation, at least, building the functions to see how it'll work in this sort of pilot test environment. But we do need a lot of things from the community as well. The number one is feedback, what you guys think is important in research. We have a survey that's pinned on the front page of ResearchHub. It's been up there for a while, but it lists all the reputation metrics in research. And we want you guys to go on and rank them if you can and tell us what you think is important. We also could use contributors, people on the platform actually going through, talking about peer reviews, talking about publications and telling us how it's working. And then we could use eventually, we want to do things a little more on-chain, a little more Web3. So eventually we'll need some Web3 development help too. So if you're a Web3 developer, make sure you reach out to us over Discord. And personally, one of the opinions I think we're missing is opinions outside of academia. So a lot of us are academics, but we may not represent, private researchers or industry researchers who might have a really different way of looking at things that we haven't accounted for. So if these match your criteria, reach out to us. We would love to chat and understand what's important to you guys. So this is my closing slide. I think I have some QR codes after this, but just wanted to recognize the team. You're probably familiar with most of them. founders being Brian and Patrick, lead developers Kobe and Pat Liu. And then on the foundation side, we've grown quite a bit since the last time we've talked in public, but we have Ricardo leading operations, Jeff in business, myself in community and open source dev, Ivan doing growth and marketing, Edwin legal and governance, Johnny doing a ton of work in science communication, and Ted in video production, keeping us looking really professional. So aside from like the formal ResearchHub Foundation team, we also have 12 editors on the platform who are going through and making content day to day, soliciting peer reviews, and just keeping the platform kind of alive and buzzing. And a lot of contributors as well who are on the science communication team, who are all been, contributing to the tweets you're seeing and like the increased social activity, trying to get the word out there about the stuff we're doing and how we're trying to help science. So with that, I'll kind of close it on this slide. This is how you can reach out to us and how you can get in contact. One thing we're specifically looking for is people who are interested in doing peer reviews. So if you have domain expertise and you're interested in hearing more targeted opportunities, you can scan this QR code, document your info, and we'll reach out to you if we have any opportunities that align really well with your expertise. You can always do a peer review without filling out this form, but this just lets us kind of tell you which ones are specifically really relevant for you. So I think we probably have some time left. That's all I have. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. That was great, Tyler. And yeah, now looking at all the faces, in the team, you kind of like realize how much we've grown since last year. It's amazing. It's actually amazing. Totally. Because this all happened organically. We had all these people joining, and they were just like passionate about, our mission and trying to accelerate science with us. So yeah, it's just like really amazing to see it. I don't have any
about DSci.
Yeah,
it's just something about DSci that keeps people really engaged. I think it's the feeling that you're solving like a real problem in a really important area, and there's like there's very obvious problems in your face and people trying to solve them. So I think it's good overlap.
Yeah. Most of it is probably like a lot of disillusioned scientists that went the same kind of like challenges that we face day to day, and wanted to kind of like give a helping hand and help with what we're doing. So
for sure.
Yeah. So there's no questions in the Q&A. I guess you were too clear, and so I don't have any questions. But apart from that, I would say please join, like if you're interested in peer reviewing or just like joining the community, as Tyler said. We are pretty friendly, I would say. So just like join our Discord, join directly on ResearchHub. If there's someone new, that is doing something, we'll definitely notice and probably reach out to you. And if you're passionate about peer reviews and you're doing peer reviews already, we would really love to talk to you, even if there's no peer review, like even if there's not like preprints available, we'll find one for you if that matches your expertise, and put up a bounty so that you can fulfill it. That, I would say, closes the day, I think. So I really wanted to we really want to close the day with a few updates from us. So you saw what are some of the updates from the ResearchHub team. You saw some of the work that we're doing at the ResearchHub Foundation. Hope that sparked a little bit of interest in you.